When it comes to memorable anime fighting games, the Dragon Ball Budokai series is the first thing that most people would put on their lists, and rightfully so. Having sold well over 12 million copies in total, the Budokai games were more than just popular for their time. But do they still hold up today? Please join me as I'm gonna replay the very first Dragon Ball Z Budokai over 20 years after it came out. Welcome to Frame Dropped. Back in 2002, the Dragon Ball gaming landscape was nothing like it is today. There have been plenty of games before Budokai, but most of them were only released in Japan, and 5 years had already passed since the then last worldwide release, Dragon Ball GT Final Bout for the PlayStation 1. A game that wasn't received too well in Western territories, mostly because the Dragon Ball GT arc didn't air in Europe and North America yet. In fact, it took a couple more years for that to happen. But Dragon Ball Z Budokai released during the perfect time. In 2002, the story of Goku, his friends and his foes had taken over the world. Dragon Ball Z was still airing on American networks and everyone was excited for this new fighting game by Bandai. Simply titled Dragon Ball Z in Japan, it was a casual fighting game containing 23 playable characters from the Dragon Ball Z universe with their original Japanese voices and a story that retold the anime up to the Cell Saga, including some alternative what-if scenarios. A year after the exclusive PS2 release, there also was a GameCube version, but I played the original PS2 game over and over back in the day, despite probably never owning it now that I think about it. So that's what I'm gonna play for this episode of Modern Reviews as well. Well, almost. I decided to play the version included in the HD collection for the PS3 just because it's a little smoother and easier on the eye, but apart from that it's basically the same old PS2 game. And for the signature Frame Dropped Modern Reviews realization of how fucking old I've gotten, I noticed this. The original Budokai came out in 2002. The Budokai HD collection came out 10 years later in 2012. That means that from this point on, the time between today and the release of the HD collection is further apart than the release of the HD collection and the release of the original game. But anyway, let's get into this. I can't wait to relive my childhood with the very first Dragon Ball Z Budokai game. Okay, so after a kick-ass intro that from this point on will be a feature of almost every Dragon Ball game, and which for some reason only in Europe consisted of simple clips from the story mode, you are greeted with a menu select screen. I'm mentioning that because through the nature of how fighting games are built, there are a couple of different modes to spend your time in, opposed to just one big campaign. There is a story mode where you can relive a condensed version of the Dragon Ball Z storyline, but then there's also a duel mode where you can fight a real or virtual opponent, a training mode to test out all characters' movesets, then a skills mode in order to buy and equip custom skills, world match, which is basically a tournament mode, and options, which are just options. We'll get into more detail as to what all of those modes do in a bit, but regardless of what you choose, in the end it all comes down to, you guessed it, the fighting. So the idea is very simple. Fights are held one-on-one on a 2.5D plane, which means that you can also sidestep to the fore or background in order to evade attacks, and the goal is to get your opponent's health bar down to 0 in order to win the match. As with probably any fighting game of your choice, there's a punch button, a kick button and a block button. Only Budokai's specialty here is that there's also a button for shooting ki blasts. All of those buttons can be used in various combos, which also trigger signature series super attacks. Say that 5 times in a row. Although the fighting here is not really complex and also a lot slower than in later, more refined Dragon Ball games, there is a great amount of thought that apparently was put into this. And even if it's a cliché by this point, it really is easy to pick up but tough to master. For example, ki blasts and special attacks use up ki, a resource that can be refilled through basic fighting or charging up. But if you do decide to charge up, you leave yourself wide open for attacks. Also, true to the Dragon Ball anime, some characters can transform into stronger versions of themselves, which boosts all of their attacks but constantly drains ki, and also leaves you in a vulnerable state if you happen to run out of ki. So there is a level of risk evaluation that you have to do as a player. In contrast to future Dragon Ball games, there are no shortcuts for special attacks, so you always have to input an entire combo to trigger it. Although most combos aren't that hard to pull off. By the way, why do so many fighting games display random letters as button inputs as opposed to the PlayStation buttons? I get that you might want to play the game with a fight stick, but is it so difficult to make you choose or recognize if you're playing with a controller? Anyways, I still remember how to pull off the Kamehameha from my younger days. P-P-P-P-E! P-P-P-P-E! P-P-P-P! Sorry. And when two more powerful attacks clash, you'll have to rotate your analog sticks, which if you play against a computer, doesn't have to be too aggressive. But if you play against your friend on the couch, well, let's say we always either used to break the controllers or our own thumbs. Those were the golden days of gaming. Okay, first of all, remember when I just said the HD collection is basically the same game? Well, largely that is true, except for one thing, the music. Because the original game's composer, Kenji Yamamoto, has been accused of plagiarizing most songs. And therefore Bandai decided to change the music entirely to a mix of soundtracks from later Dragon Ball games. But while recording, I have to turn off the music anyways, and while playing the game I was listening to the original Budokai 1 soundtrack in order to please my nostalgia cells, and that's also what you're hearing in the background right now. Alright, so when you're first setting up a fight, you probably notice that the character select screen looks pretty barren. That is because most of the characters and stages have to be unlocked through playing through the story mode first, which I always absolutely loved about Dragon Ball games and kinda disliked in other fighting games. I want to have a reason to play through all the different modes and experience what the game has to offer, and this is definitely one way of doing it. So the story mode is basically a pretty condensed version of Dragon Ball Z's story up to the Cell Saga, so the Buu Saga is not included in this game. You play through the most memorable fights from the anime, including voiced cutscenes, which was pretty neat for its time. For someone who prefers the Japanese voices anyway, this isn't a big deal, but this very first Budokai game does not feature English character voices in the PS2 version. When I say things like the most memorable fights and condensed story, I really mean it. I thought about it, and I'm confident that someone who hasn't read or seen Dragon Ball Z wouldn't get Budokai's story at all. This mode leaves out a lot. Characters come out of nowhere without being introduced, and you can plow through the entire story in less than a day. Although the final Cell Saga seems quite sizable in comparison to everything else. That still doesn't have to be a negative thing though. Budokai's story mode doesn't overstay its welcome, and it was obviously made for people who knew Dragon Ball and bought the game because of that and not the other way around. That also becomes apparent when you realize that the presentation tries its best to mimic the style of the TV show with, for example, narrative previews before each new arc. Only some dialogue doesn't quite seem true to what the characters would usually say, but maybe that's because of the translation.
Trunks.
Classic Vegeta. The really cool thing about the story mode though is that you don't only have to fight opponents to progress, but there are also some so-called action missions which, let me tell you, were so cool back then, even if they might seem a little gimmicky now. For example, you have to line up Raditz while Piccolo is charging up his special beam cannon, or you have to train as Goku on your way to Namek, or defeat a fake Vegeta, okay, that one might seem a little bit lazy, or defeat Android 19 before Goku's health runs out because of his heart disease. Also, you don't immediately have access to each character's entire movesets, but earn new skills along the way. More on that later. There isn't really a tutorial in the traditional sense, but in my opinion the game does a good enough job of easing you into the controls. The overall difficulty curve starts off pretty easy and kinda stays like that for a while. Wait. Fuck. I actually played on easy up until now. Okay, let's ramp it up a bit. Okay, to my defense, most fights still feel as easy as before. Maybe that is because I myself became stronger? Like in Dragon Ball? Would everybody get stronger with each fight? Whoa. But during the Cell Saga the difficulty curve starts to shoot up quite a bit. Although up until the end it still feels fair if you play on normal. Especially Gohan's final fight felt easier than Goku's fight against Cell. But then again, Gohan should be stronger than Goku at this point in the story, I guess. Okay, now comes the cool part that blew my mind as a kid. After finishing the story, you might go back to the character select screen and notice that although more characters are playable now, there are still some that are grayed out. So you go back to the story mode and discover that now there is a completely new menu with new story chapters that you haven't played yet. These chapters are sometimes just additional episodes from their respective arcs that arguably could have just been included in the main mode, but sometimes they offer alternative viewpoints. For example, instead of having to control Raditz as Goku, you can now ruin your analog stick as Piccolo, or else you will die. One of the additional missions per saga, usually the last one, is a what-if scenario where you get to play as the villain. This way you'll get to see what would happen if Frieza would gain eternal life, or if Cell would absorb Krillin, only to wake up and realize that 10 days was probably too much of a wait for the Cell games to begin, and I absolutely love that wackiness. All in all, I still really enjoyed the story mode, even though so many years have passed since I first played it. It threw me back into my golden days and I wasn't annoyed by the retelling at all. I know, newer Dragon Ball games always try to do something new, which is understandable because the original story has been retold so many times by now. But the story still is absolutely dope and Dragon Ball continues to be my favorite manga of all time. But in the end, I wish that I could also play through the Buu saga. I don't know, but I honestly thought that it would be kinda cool to have DLC for older games because of that. Weirdly enough, if you look at the back of the original PS2 box, there are a lot of characters such as Majin Vegeta, Dabura and Babidi that are not in the final game because they are from the Buu saga. In fact, Buu himself is on the back of the box. Bandai did however remove those characters from future versions of the game. But one character that appears in the beginning of the Buu saga is playable in the game, the Great Saiyaman. And the rest of the final roster isn't too bad for the very first Budokai game. 23 of the most important Z fighters and villains can be controlled, including some characters that were only available in Budokai 1 after being reintroduced after quite a while in later games, such as Zarbon, Dodoria and Android number 19. All these characters can be put to the test in either the practice mode, where you can test out your combos without any pressure of the enemy attacking you, or in the much more exciting duel mode, where you can play against a second human player, against a computer, or if you were a weird kid like I was, select the computer versus computer mode, max out the AI difficulty, and plan out a tournament with every character on a sheet of paper in order to find out who is the strongest. And you know what? Fuck it, I don't care how old I am, I'm gonna do this one more time.
I wanna be the very best, like no one ever was. Catch them is my real test, to train them is my cause. Dragon Ball!
In the first round, Dodoria beat Riku, Trunks defeated his own father, and Mr. Satan/Hercule lost his very first fight as expected. There also was a very weird match between Teen Gohan and Great Saiyaman. Anyway, in the next round, Frieza then annihilated Trunks, Piccolo lost to number 17, and Ginyu defeated Raditz as expected. Goku made it to the semifinals by first winning against Tien, then Ginyu, but then lost against Frieza. Probably just because he was too tired from fighting 3 fights in a row. The final match, Frieza against the surprising underdog Android number 17. After an exhilarating fight, even Frieza's final form wasn't enough to stop 17's power blitz. Android number 17 emerges as the winner of this Dragon Ball Z Budokai 1 tournament. Alright then, back to the video. So, what else can you do besides just fighting matches and training after you beat the story? At the heart of Budokai's endgame stands the Edit Skills section, where you can customize the skill set of your favorite character by attaching skills that you earned throughout the story mode into free slots. You can then choose custom in most other game modes to use those skills. You won't get an entirely different character through that, but you can do some fun things such as using a Senzu Bean when you die in order to come back to life and basically cheat your way to victory. Nice. However, the majority of skills cannot be earned through simply playing the story, but have to be bought from none other than Mr. Popo's skill shop. In order to gain the currency Zenny, you'll have to take part in a different game mode titled World Match, that, as the name suggests, is a tournament against opponents that get stronger and stronger with each turn. The fun or frustrating thing, depending which side you're on, is that every fight here takes place on the world stage, which means that you can defeat your opponent by simply throwing him or her out of the ring. But that also means that that can and will happen to you as well. And not even a senzu bean can save you from that. I wouldn't have spent nearly as much time here if it wasn't for the skills that I needed, but it's a fun game mode nevertheless. You can also buy 2 more world match difficulties from Mr. Popo that then take 4 and 5 consecutive rounds in order to win, but also offer way more money than the original mode. After finishing Adept, you also finally unlock the most important character, Hercule, or how I always knew him, Mr. Satan. The thing with skills is that you sometimes have to decide whether you want all the transformations for a character or more special attacks, because there is only so much space. If you think, fuck that, I want to have all the skills at once, oh boy, do I have the skill for you. It is titled Breakthrough and combines all skills into one. But in order to get it, you first need the Dragon Balls. And getting them is kinda a huge pain in the butt. You have to buy them from the shop when they appear under the recommended skills tab. And if you don't want to buy multiples of all other skills first, you'll have to enter the shop and cancel out until a Dragon Ball appears. And if you have my luck, then that can sometimes take hundreds of tries. And then when you finally summon Shenron, you only get the breakthrough skill for one character that you have to select from a list of 3 random characters. So it's not the most thought through mechanic, but I still give them credit for implementing the Dragon Balls in some way. The final thing that you can buy is a new mode on the title screen titled The Legend of Mr. Satan, that even has its own title screen. It's basically an arcade mode with a quick story, where you can only play as Mr. Satan against various opponents and sometimes have to fulfill additional requirements, such as defeating Vegeta within a time limit in order to make it to the bathroom. The Legend of Mr. Satan is a fun idea and a perfect final unlockable in the game, but there is no real incentive to play it again after experiencing it once. All in all, I really enjoyed replaying through the original Budokai after all these years. A weird little thing is that I used to dislike the game's art style, probably because it just looks so different compared to later Dragon Ball games. But for some reason it started to grow on me. I don't know, maybe it is because so many games nowadays use cel shading that it's refreshing to see something else? Or is it just my nostalgia speaking? What do you guys think about that? But when it came out, Dragon Ball Z Budokai received mixed to average reviews, and I kinda get why. There are still a lot of flaws present that were only ironed out in later iterations of the franchise. Although the fighting is obviously arcadey, it also doesn't quite capture the spirit of the anime yet. It often just feels too sluggish. But in other parts, Budokai really manages to feel right. The presentation is just awesome. From the menus to the announcer at the world match to recognizable and sometimes even interactive stages to just some small details such as how Hercule/Mr. Satan uses a jetpack because he can't fly on his own. And I guess a lot of fans seem to agree back then, because even though this was the first, it was also the best-selling Budokai game with over 3.5 million copies sold. But what do you guys think? Do you remember enjoying the very first Dragon Ball Z Budokai? And which one is your favorite Dragon Ball game and why? Tell me in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I love you all. See you guys next time.